Is obesity druggable? And we start right now. Hi, my name is Dr. Pete. I have a PhD in biochemistry and I'm also a Nutrition Network health practitioner. I'm a retired associate professor of chemistry and also a teacher of chemistry for over 28 years. The inspiration for today's episode came from a recent edition of 60 Minutes where Leslie Stahl interviewed an obesity doctor whose name was Dr. Fatima Stanford, who is associated both with Harvard and Mass General Hospital. To summarize the 60 Minutes broadcast, they made clear that, number one, that there's an obesity epidemic in the United States and for that matter around the world. And that number two, these people are at wit's end, right? They are calorie restricting and they're exercising their brains out. They're not getting results. And then comes along these diabetes drugs, Wegovy and Ozempic, which are used to manage, this is a key word, manage diabetes. But the use of these drugs, it has been found, leads to significant weight loss. So now people are taking these drugs in order to reduce their weight. Let me emphasize significant weight loss at a cost of $1,300 a month. First, do these drugs treat the underlying cause of diabetes and obesity? Secondly, is there a lifestyle change that does address the underlying cause of diabetes and obesity that obese people can shift to, get their weight loss, and live a long, healthy life? In order to understand the underlying cause of diabetes and obesity, we first must consider why people get fat in the first place. The best place to start with this is to look at the animal kingdom. On this slide, I have 3 pond and soil organisms. We're looking at a bacterium, we're looking at a worm, and we're also looking at an amoeba. And these guys all share the same common characteristics when it comes to nutrients in food as humans. They have sensory operations that allow them to find their food. And then they have signaling that allows them to take the food in. Then they break it down. And what do they do with the food? They burn some of those calories. And then they store the leftover calories as fat. Animals store fat in order to survive the time periods between food sources. And the storage of fat as a very efficient source of calories is a common thread throughout the animal kingdom. Let's look at some more examples. Let's talk about the ruby-throated hummingbird. Every day, this hummingbird eating nectar will push its blood glucose to 700 mg per deciliter. And a direct quote from the paper is that its liver will turn pearly white in terms of fat. And then through the night, this hummingbird burns off the fat, the liver returns to normal, and its blood glucose comes down to the same range as a human. Every year, this hummingbird undergoes a migration which is somewhere between 1,500 to 2,000 miles. And in preparation for that, this hummingbird more than doubles its body weight in fat. During the flight or during the migration, this hummingbird switches from glucose metabolism to fat metabolism. And if this bird does not put on enough fat weight, it will run out of energy, fall into the ocean, and die. Take the grizzly bear, for example. Everybody knows the story of the grizzly bear, right? They hibernate every year. But what happens in the months that lead up to the point where they hibernate? So these guys start to eat tons and tons of berries, right? And they're eating these berries late in the fall when these berries have ripened and are full of fructose. When you look at the scat that these guys are putting out, you can count upwards of 10,000 seeds. These guys double their body weight in fat, and when they go into hibernation, they lower their metabolic rate. Then down on the lower left here, we have the ground squirrel. And this particular ground squirrel does the same kind of thing. Rather than hibernation, this thing goes into a state of torpor to get through the cold months when food is scarce. And again, it doubles its body weight in fat before moving into into this state of torpor for the winter. In the center here we have, on the lower part of the slide, we have the godwit. And the godwit is an ocean bird that is famous for the longest known migration. That's 8,400 miles from Alaska to New Zealand. And pre-migration, this bird, along with the other examples that I'm giving you here, gorges itself on food. That food is converted into fat. It doubles its body weight, and then it makes the migration utilizing the fat as fuel. And if it doesn't build up enough fat stores, then that fuel will run out mid-migration. The bird will drop into the ocean and die. And then lastly, over on the right, we have the lowly mosquito. This particular mosquito lives in the Phoenix, Arizona area. And as the cold months approach, this mosquito stops eating blood and shifts to nectar and gorges on nectar. And the reason that it does that is because it's going to double its body weight in fat, and then it moves into a state is like hibernation. It is called diapause, which allows it to get through the cold months until things warm up again, and then it shifts back, it becomes active, and it shifts back to a diet of blood. The point is that the entire animal kingdom, right down to the lowliest single-cell pond organism, has the capacity to rapidly store fat, including humans. This capacity is embedded in our genetics, and secondly, depends on the type of macronutrients that we are eating, the amount, and the timing in which they arrive into our system. So with this, let's turn to the biochemistry of this important metabolism and see how it's driving obesity. In humans, our capacity to rapidly store energy as fat is based on the integration between a metabolic pathway called glycolysis, which is connected to the mitochondria, shown on this slide in gray, in combination with and integrated with a metabolic pathway which is called fructose metabolism, which is shown on the right side of the slide in red. Collectively, you are looking at a system which is called either the fat switch or the survival switch, depending on the context of the discussion. And since here we're talking about obesity, we are talking about mechanistically a process which is called the fat switch, going from a point where we are in a situation of burning to a situation where we are predominantly storing the incoming calories as fat. This model has recently been proposed by Dr. Richard Johnson, who has published well over 700 publications in this area, and he regularly speaks at various conferences, and he's written a book recently called Nature Wants Us to Be Fat. I also provide a reference at the bottom of the slide. So let's look and see how this system works to put on fat weight in humans. Now you can think of the glucose coming in from a meal. As long as it is not rising above a certain threshold, this will be funneled into the glycolytic pathway, which again is shown in gray. And as a function of that pathway, the substrate or the substances that are produced at the end of the pathway are funneled into the mitochondria, where we maximize the production of ATP. And ATP is the molecular money that our cells and our organs, that basically our body utilizes or spends in order to do things. We also store some of that glucose as glycogen, which is the main storage form of glucose. And if there is enough glucose funneling into glycolysis, then we are also going to produce a little bit of fat. Once glucose rises above a certain level, the fat switch is triggered. In other words, we activate fructose uric acid metabolism, and up to 30% of the incoming glucose is now funneled into fructose metabolism via the polyol pathway. So now if we think about our metaphor that we have this pooling glucose behind a dam, think of it this way: the glucose has risen to a point where the dam has to now respond to this massive amount of substrate that is being held behind the dam. And so what happens is the floodgates are opened, and now we funnel that excess glucose into fructose uric acid metabolism. And if you were to look at a dam in that state, you would see these massive jets of water spewing out and dropping down into the river. The current in the river is now massively flowing, right? And you can think of this as fructose uric acid metabolism. Now all of this substrate is being diverted, and we are now breaking it down in a different way than we were when we were just utilizing glycolysis. Once fructose uric acid metabolism is activated, we have a significant acute decline of ATP in the cell along with phosphate, with an inverse, an acute rise in the signaling molecule uric acid, which activates a number of processes, including de novo lipogenesis, which in English means fat synthesis. So we produce oil droplets literally right in the liver, and a large proportion of that fat is pushed out into the circulatory system, where one of its destinations is adipose tissue, leading to substantial rapid weight gain. On this next slide, I am summarizing the known clinical and animal studies that show fructose uric acid metabolism as a driver of gout, kidney disease, obesity, fatty liver disease, Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, even including sugar and alcohol addiction, and don't forget the main topic of this video, obesity. Activation of this pathway involves amount and the timing in which these macronutrients are reaching the liver, and include hyperglycemia. That would be eating a meal which is high in glucose. That would be foods like potatoes and rice. The combination with alcohol, for example, in the case of adults eating the evening meal, added sugar, which brings in a high load of both glucose and, you guessed it, fructose at the same time. Processed food, which includes glutamate, inosine monophosphate, and adenosine monophosphate, high salt, and conditions which drive hypoxia, like sleep apnea. Chronic activation of fructose uric acid metabolism drives hyperinsulinemia, chronic high levels of insulin, insulin resistance, fatty liver disease, diabetes, the obesogenic state, meaning this is a main central driver of obesity. When we ask the question about the relationship of this metabolic driver to behavior, what the clinical and animal studies show over decades is that activation of this pathway drives hunger. It causes the increase of food intake. There is a preference that is driven for sugar, including and more so the preference for fructose. We also have a preference for fat, and usually in the obesogenic issue, we have the combination when we're eating these meals of all of these macronutrients coming in together. So we have the combination of sugar, high glutamate, and fat all at the same time, which causes the overactivation of the fructose uric acid metabolism and the drive to put on fat weight. Now, since we know opening this pathway, fructose uric acid metabolism, has behavioral effects, what is the brain effect? We know that alcohol, sugar, and fructose activate a very important protein in the brain called delta phos-B, which gets activated when the dopaminergic pathway, the food reward system, is activated, which we know happens during fructose uric acid metabolism, with the result of inducing the production of delta phos-B. Delta phos-B is a very well characterized protein by the scientists who work in the area of drug addiction. We know that delta phos-B drives the addictive state. It drives the motivational state to focus on what it is that we are eating. It drives cravings and relapse, and has been shown, again, even though I already said it, to be activated by alcohol, sugar, which includes both glucose and fructose, and there is at least one study that shows that fructose activates delta phos-B and is activated by natural rewards, food, sex, exercise, behaviors required for the survival of humans. Additionally, there are studies that show a direct connection between delta phosphB, which we know drives the addictive state, POMC, and the agouti-related peptide system in the hypothalamus. And this is going to be important to us as we move on to a discussion about Wegovy and Ozempic and whether or not those drugs are actually treating the underlying cause of obesity. So let's summarize what we know so far. The first thing is humans are not that different than single-cell organisms when it comes to our macronutrients that we need for survival. We have a signaling system. There are taste receptors in our tongue. There are taste receptors in our intestinal system, and there are other sensory systems that we use. Vision, for example, smell, all those things allow us to signal, to get signaling to our brain in regard to what it is that we are going to eat. We have a primary metabolic switch, the fat switch, which as those macronutrients come in and we activate that pathway, which is talking to the brain. And in the brain, we have not only a brain switch there, but we also have a hormonal switch, which allows us then to turn and focus on bringing those calories in, and ultimately is hyperactivated for certain macronutrients, the hyperglycemia, the alcohol, the added sugar with the glucose and the fructose, and the processed food, which is bringing in the glutamate, inosine monophosphate, and adenosine monophosphate. And when we have all of those things together, we have a perfect storm, which leads to overeating, drives the overeating. So all of this together brings us back to the 60 Minutes broadcast and the discussion about Wegovy and Ozempic. And I agree, and hopefully I've laid the groundwork for you, that when Stanford asserted that obesity is a brain disease, there is definitely a brain disease component. But what comes first? The chicken or the egg? To understand how Wegovy and Ozempic work, I'm going to draw your attention to this slide, and specifically the big red circle that you can see sort of above the center. To keep things simple, when we eat, our intestines release a protein called GLP-1, and the function, or at least one of the functions of GLP-1, is to make its way to the brain, where it interacts with its receptor called GLP-1R to cause satiety. What that means in English is that you will stop eating earlier in the meal. Now, in the standard American diet, and in particular eating the substances that I've talked about that activate this pathway, the relationship between GLP-1 and its receptor gets disrupted. So the satiety factor isn't happening correctly. So the way that Wegovy and Ozempic work is by causing the elevation in activity of the GLP-1R receptor so that you force the issue of the satiety. And therefore, somebody who's suffering from obesity and taking those drugs will stop eating earlier in the meal and therefore have less calories coming in that are driving the activation of fructose uric acid metabolism, and therefore over time will lose weight. Furthermore, as pointed out by Stanford in the 60-minute broadcast, Wegovy and Ozempic are also functioning by interacting with the POMC and the agouti regulated protein system to further manipulate the controls on pathways that lead to weight gain. Let's step back then and ask the question, where exactly are these drugs operating? And when you look at this slide and you think about the model that I have laid out to you very carefully, that's substantiated in the literature, that the Wegovy and the Ozempic are operating on the brain switch. And I'm going to ask you, what does this have to do with the underlying cause? These drugs are not operating on the underlying cause of obesity or diabetes, right? As long as you're taking the drug, it's true, you're going to lose weight. Not arguing about that. But the underlying cause has not been addressed, and this is the metabolic switch. And the problem with that is somebody taking these drugs and literally spending $1,300 a month for it. If they continue to eat the way that they were, that got them into the obesogenic state in the first place, then that pressure still exists, even though they are taking the drug to lose the weight. So what are one of the consequences of this? Well, if they stop taking the drug and they are eating the same way that they were before they started taking the drug, then they're going to become obesogenic again, and the diabetes is going to be roaring back. In fact, the underlying cause of the obesity and the diabetes, that pressure has been there all along while they're taking the drug. This is why they call obesity management and diabetes management. These are the terms that they use to describe when you're taking Wegovy and Ozempic, what the effects are. You're not dealing with the underlying cause of these diseases. So is there another option? Is there a way to get obesity reversal that deals specifically with the underlying cause? And I believe the answer is yes. And common sense dictates that we're going to eliminate hyperglycemia. We are going to eliminate or cut significantly down alcohol. We're going to stop altogether eating sugar, which has both bringing in high loads of glucose and fructose. And we're going to eliminate processed food, which is responsible for bringing in the glutamate, the inosine monophosphate, and the adenosine monophosphate. And if we suffer from sleep apnea, we are going to get treated. We are going to shift to a way of eating which involves whole, real food. We're going to buy whole, real food. We're going to cut it up. We're going to cook it, and we're going to eat it. If one suffers from severe obesity and type 2 diabetes together, it may well be a necessity to actually cut into the carbs and lower the total number of carbs being eaten each day. We eat a wide variety of different natural proteins, right? Protein that we buy, we cut up, not processed, right? We're not eating processed food, and we avoid processed meat. We eat a wide range of natural fats, olive oil, avocado oil, beef tallow, lard, butter, as long as the oil is not processed. So we avoid the seed oils. Lastly, the lifestyle that I'm talking about has been around for a few hundred years. There's literally literature in this area that extends all the way back into the mid-1800s. Now, there are some that are going to question what I'm talking about. In fact, the medical establishment really is a barrier to this. So I'm going to point out two major publications. This is very important. The first one that I'm going to cite is a paper in 2018 from Verda Health Scientist, lead author Dr. Sarah Hallberg. And this paper shows, it was a clinical study, the first year of it. It shows that their patients established a 12% weight loss, which is in a similar range to if you're taking Wegovy and Ozempic. Additionally, there were other aspects of that paper that showed that the low-carb lifestyle is healthy and that it actively reverses type 2 diabetes. More recently, in 2023, and I selected this paper because it is so recent. The lead author is David Unwin out of the UK, and they show that for patients over an 8-year study that these guys are showing about an 11% reduction in weight. So let's address the two options here. One option for weight loss is to go down the road of Wegovy and Ozempic. So what are you getting for this? Do the drugs treat the underlying cause? And the answer is no. Do they drive weight loss? And the answer is yes. How much do they cost? $1,300 a month. Do you realize that if you're 60 years old and you pay $1,300 a month for this drug and you have to take it for the rest of your life, and let's say the rest of your life is for the next 30 years, then you are going to spend close to $500,000. And I don't know about you guys that are in your 60s, but in my neighborhood, we could buy a house for that. If you stop the drug and you go back to the way that you were eating before, then you're going to regain the weight. And you also are going to have a diabetes problem that comes roaring back. Ultimately, if you go the drug route, this is called obesity management, not obesity reversal, because these drugs do not address the common driver of this disease in the first place. Now, let's summarize the low-carb lifestyle. First and foremost, you lose weight. That's defined by the literature. Secondly, it treats the underlying cause. So that means you actually are going to reverse obesity along with the reversal of the diabetes. The lifestyle is safe and it's healthy. And lastly, it does not cost $1,300 a month. So if you are suffering from obesity, or even if you are just significantly overweight at this point, you're standing at a fork in the road. And I know, because I have experience with this, having dealt with the stigma of a chronic disease myself, having felt out of shape and overweight and all of that business, and being just sick to death of the whole situation, right? All of the diets and the other business which is circulating at the top of the internet culture. You can go down the fork of utilizing the drugs, or you can join me on the left side of the road. In the low-carb lifestyle, you can lose the weight. You can reverse the comorbidities. You can put gout in remission, for example. I've done that, and I reversed my prediabetes, and I lost my weight. This is an amazing lifestyle. Take a look at the science and make a decision that can be lifelong and not dependent on taking an expensive drug that is not dealing with the underlying cause of the disease in the first place. Thank you for listening to my presentation. If you enjoyed what you heard and you would like to know more, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and hit the bell next to it in order to know when the next time is that I publish a video.